Hey, this is Mr. V, doing a book review today for The East of Eden by John Steinbeck. Before I do my book review, I want you to know I try to do a spoiler-free book review, so if you see me looking down occasionally, I just have some notes to not give any spoilers away. So, let's get into the book review for East of Eden by John Steinbeck. So, this book, as it says, is about that it follows two families and it's set in the rich farmland of California's Salinas Valley. This sprawling and often brutal novel follows the intertwined destinies of two families, the Trasks and the Hamiltons. And that's about as much as I can say without giving any spoilers away, which you'll hear me talk about in just a bit. But before I get into my official review, there's a few things I want to comment on for this book, East of Eden. The first thing is I feel that you should probably be over the age of 18 to read it, as there is a lot of prostitution in this book, and they talk about it a lot in terms of different whorehouses and things like that. And the other thing I want you guys to know is that I gave you what the book jacket says is East of Eden is about, but that's about as much as I can say, because this story is super complex and there's a lot of moving pieces in this book, and that's why I can't go much more in depth than just what the book jacket says. I'll go a little more in depth in a bit, but even an example is when I tried to explain one of the storylines to my wife the other week. I was even giving her spoilers, and it was still, she saw how complex it was and how hard it was for me to explain certain parts of the book. So that's why I can only give a very brief description of the book. But let's get into the book review right now. So, I thought that East of Eden was definitely a very interesting book. It was very fun to read. And I think it was fun to read because it had an amazing storyline. It really did. Despite it sounding simple, the storyline itself was just amazing because of how complex it is and it becomes. As it said, that basically you're following two different families. You're just following two families. But there are so many storylines within those two families because there's many characters, which then leads to many events. And something just draws you in right from the beginning. John Steinbeck put something in there that just draws you in. And it's just, I said, there's so many different characters, so many different events happen, and the cool part is he intertwines all these events. Not every event intertwines, but basically all these storylines somehow connect, despite him following all this vast array of characters. So I'd say that's why it was such an amazing storyline. And the other thing that made it amazing was how real it feels when you reading the book, because the families feel very real in that it is not your perfect family type of thing. There are definitely fights and all that, yet he doesn't exaggerate too much. It's not like that everyone in the family is a psycho type of thing either. So I feel he had a good balance, which made it feel real. Because in both families, there is the typical closeness, yet there's also the typical feuds or the fights. And how there are people in the family, there's many family members, how they will use deception against different family members for their own benefit. And what happens? The retaliation, the fights, how some members will stand and fight, others will just take off and be like, I'm done with the family type of thing. And there's so many different storylines that it ends up becoming this really complex story about family. That's what it ends up becoming, about family issues and the different fights that families go through, but the good and the bad. Some of the good that you have when you need to turn to your family, but also some of the bad, because there's many characters, and because you're also following two families. But and also the fights, that he makes it feel super real because it takes years to build up. In the book, it takes years to build up. Just like with any big family fight, normally it doesn't just happen overnight. Yeah, you can get into a minor fight overnight, but the big fights normally take years. And in the book, he fleshes it out and goes through that well, and it kind of shows that nothing is instant. So I think, that was really cool because, again, it's very complex. And what makes it complex is not only the characters, it's not only the storylines, but the characters were also great. As he had a great list of characters because there was all different types of personalities, like all different types, as there were many characters. I think one family had 9 kids. I don't know for sure, but it had a lot of kids in one of the families. But like, there are so many different types of people in this book. You have the rich people, the poor people, the happy people, the angry people, the hard workers, the lazy people, the honest people, the liars, the successes and the failures. And you also have the good people and the bad people. Yet, it isn't always like one set of people is good and one set of people is bad. It's not always like that. So it's like, he does a vast array of characters and their personalities and all these types of things, to where it is really cool because there's so many characters and so many plot lines. You do start to feel a lot of emotion for these characters. Like, you do feel happy or sad when something happens. You do start to get angry at a certain character. It does go through things like that because there's just, I don't know, the writing of it is so well, and I'll talk about the writing in just a few minutes, but it was just so good. And I think another part was because the characters, they felt real. Now, as for some of the things I did not like about the story, the first part that I did not like about the story, it's not something, I would not say I don't like it, but I want to give you a big caution for this book, if you're considering, is that there are a lot of characters. Because as I told you already, there's 2 different families, and I think one of the families, they have a lot of kids, but then there's the parents, the grandparents, and then they have their kids and all that. And it's just, there's a lot of characters throughout the whole book. And while he develops the characters well, I think he does a great job with character development. Be aware that there are a lot of characters. Some characters are very short-lived. Some characters are throughout basically the whole novel. And so, just be aware of that. It's just a word of caution if you're considering this book. And that because there are so many characters, there are so many storylines with each character and different types of stories, things like that. And I enjoyed this, but you needed to remember which character was which, who was linked to what storyline. And as I said, he intertwines the storylines to where sometimes it can get just a little confusing about, okay, what storyline was this character with? And, and sometimes he'll skip chapters with the characters, and then the character will come back. And as I said, there's a lot of characters, which then leads to a lot of storylines. So it's not something that I would say I didn't like, but it's a big word of caution, and at times it was a little difficult. So you definitely want to be aware of that. But now, one thing I really didn't like is there was one storyline that I felt was completely unnecessary. I did not feel it was needed at all. This will be a spoiler. If you don't want to know it, skip forward about a minute. But the spoiler was basically, there was just racism against one specific character, and they go through the racist things that the character goes through. But I felt the reason I didn't like it was that I felt it added nothing to the story. It really didn't, in terms of they were just calling him racist names. They were treating him differently, but it really didn't amount to anything. All it amounted to was people just calling him racist terms. And I just felt it added nothing to the story overall. And, maybe I missed something, but in terms of that was one thing I really did not like, because I felt it was almost useless, or meaningless to the story. Not useless, but meaningless. So, that was one thing I didn't like. But anyway, back to this story for the things that the review. So for the writing style, I thought John Steinbeck did a great job writing this book, like his style of writing, because it flows super smoothly to where it's super easy to follow. It's very easy to follow, and it's very easy to get captured in the writing. That, as I said, there's a lot of different storylines, and it becomes a complex story. Yet each story in itself is not confusing. Each storyline in itself is pretty easy to follow. But the only reason it makes it complex is just there's so many of them. But it's so easy to get captured in his writing, and that was one thing that was really great. And as I said earlier, I felt he had a great set of characters, and he does an amazing job by doing great character development to where you felt emotion for the characters. But it was also great in that you learn about the characters through their dialogue or their actions, just like in real life. You learn about people that way. And it wasn't anything instant, but it was really good. And it was amazing that he was able to write for so many different personalities and character styles, that it really was just he did a great job in writing in that. And lastly, for the writing, I felt that he set the scenes very well in terms of the people he put in the scenes, the places scenes happened, and the overall just vibe of the scene. And he did a great job of pacing, which was, that was something that's phenomenal. Because there's been other authors that can write very well, yet the pacing can seem slightly off, where I thought Steinbeck did a great job with pacing in this book. Now, as for the end, so I always rate the end on a scale of multiple things. First of all, if you like the end, but also does it kind of wrap everything up, things like that. And, so I rate it on many things. Now, as for this end, I was not a fan of the end. I can't say anything because I would give a spoiler away. I can't say anything, but I wasn't a fan of the end. And the reason that it was more just that the last 15% of the book, 10-15% of the book just didn't fit with the rest of the story. I don't know what it is. It didn't, the last 10 to 15% didn't capture me in the same way as the rest of the story, which is why I was not a fan of the end. It's some parts were still really good and had super deep meaning, but other parts just did not fit. I don't know what it is. There was just something, and because of that, there were parts at the end that felt like they would drag a bit, or some of it felt a little forced. And that is one of the main reasons I didn't like the end, was because it didn't have the same flow as the rest of the book, and that it kind of went off course a bit, and that it dragged at points at the very end. So I still thought, yes, it still had a decent end overall, but there were things like that to me, took away from the ending. But if you make it that far, you definitely want to finish it. But, overall, I still really enjoyed the book, East of Eden, because I just thought this was it's a very complex story, but it had many super intriguing stories in between. And there's many throughout the whole story, as so much happened that it really feels like I read multiple stories when reading this book because of how much happened. But let me give it my official rating right now. So I always rate my books on a scale of 0 to 10. A 0 is an awful book that, you should never want to read. A 5 is average, and a 10 is phenomenal. If it gets 10 or anywhere near 10, you should definitely put that on your reading list, because I'm a very tough critic. So it's hard to move up even 1 point, and a 5 is average. So for East of Eden by John Steinbeck, I'm going to rate this book an 8.5. out of 10, which in my rating system is very high. Because remember, a 5 is average, and I'm rating this an 8.5. And I feel it deserves an 8.5. It almost got a 9, but the ending, the last few chapters kind of brought it down a bit. Maybe the last 6 or 7 chapters brought it down a bit. But, I definitely think it was a solid 8.5 because it was super intriguing. He just had great character development. The story just continued to flow. And, it just kept you intrigued the whole time, basically. So, I definitely recommend that you guys go and read the book East of Eden. But if you guys have any questions, comments, disagreements, please post it in the comment section below. Hope you guys click the subscribe button, as I always upload multiple different book reviews. But thank you for watching my book review today. This is Mr. V. Go enjoy reading.